Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer Jones, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. I'd like you to welcome you to this month's CCSRC round, and to thank those of you who are joining us remotely. So today we're going to hear from our speaker, and then we'll have some time at the end for a discussion and any questions that you might have. So to start, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sylvie Lambert, who is, dialing in from McGill. So Sylvie is a Canadian Research Chair in Self-Care and Illness Self-Management Support Interventions and an Assistant Professor at McGill University, Ingram School of Nursing, and a Research Associate at St. Mary's Research Centre. Sylvie completed her PhD at McGill and for postdoctoral studies at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And her research really focuses on the multidisciplinary field of psychosocial oncology to include a better understanding of the substantial impact of a cancer diagnosis on patients and their caregivers, and developing didactic illness self-management interventions. And I think we're going to hear today about that, actually, around informal caregivers. So the title of Sylvie's talk today is Beyond Unmet Needs, Count and Prevalence, Differential Impacts of Unmet Needs on the Anxiety and Depression of Informal Caregivers of Cancer Survivors. So Sylvie, I'll pass it over to you. If everybody can make sure that their mic is muted so we don't have any feedback and we can just hear it from Sylvie. And then at the end, if you have any questions for Dr. Lambert, we'll open up our microphones for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. I'm very excited to be presenting an analysis that is fresh off the press for our team, looking at the differential impact of unmet needs on the anxiety depression of informal caregivers. So I think I was told that the audience is sometimes mixed in terms of researchers as well as clinicians. So I think if you're a researcher, the analysis that we conducted is particularly is different than what has been typically done in the field of unmet supportive care needs, where the reliance has typically been on unmet need count and prevalence, whereas now we're really using different statistical methods to try to really distill down what are those unmet needs that might not necessarily be prevalent, but that have a significant impact. And if you're a clinician, I will be providing information on what are those unmet needs that are most significant for caregivers that might be part of a broader assessment in terms of knowing how the caregivers of patients that you might be working with, where they might need additional support. So most of my research program focuses on informal caregiving, and historically we know that informal caregivers play a major role in providing cancer care. That's not new. What is new is that as the burden of cancer care is no longer manageable through formal healthcare settings alone, and there is this shift towards community-based care, caregivers have become an essential extension of the formal healthcare system. And there's some studies that have found that they provide between 70 to 80% of patients' care in the community. And there's for the past actually 10 years, there's increasing numbers of economic analyses and the economic value of the support that healthcare, that informal caregivers provide. It's estimated in the billions, particularly in the US, and in the millions in Canada. And we also know that caregivers' involvement that has a positive impact on how well patients adjust. So often they'll have lower unmet needs. There's some studies that have found that they're more likely to adhere to treatment. But despite that, given other priorities, caregivers often remain a hidden workforce, and they try to provide the support to patients, often with little to no formal support. And this comes at a particularly high cost to their health. A number of studies have found that because of their caregiving role, they experience a number of physical health problems. Also, as they assume new responsibilities within the family, they might feel stretched in different direction and really struggle to remain afloat with their own life priorities. Again, And finance and work has been given particular attention in the past couple of years, and we know that at least a quarter of caregivers report financial strain. And there's some studies that have found that actually informal caregiving represents a third of the total cost of cancer. And also in terms of emotional issues, particularly anxiety and depression, we know that caregivers sometimes, in some studies, report higher anxiety and depression, lower quality of life than the patients themselves. And because of the burden that caregivers endure, there has been a lot of interest into the kind of support that they need or their unmet supportive care needs. And so our team has conducted a systematic review in 2012 of what are those unmet supportive care needs. And we were able to cluster these in 6 domains. So the first domain, caregiver impact and daily activities, emotional and psychological needs, comprehensive cancer care, such as being told about the help clinicians can provide, have a supportive relationship with clinicians, relationship unmet needs, so help communicating with the patient, have an intimate relationship with the patient, information such as knowing what to expect, information about illness and treatment, as well as spirituality. And these are ordered actually in descending order. So comprehensive cancer care, emotional and psychological were among the most prevalent. So although we know a lot about what unmet, there was 27 studies that were part of that review, and that was already 6 years ago. But although we know quite a bit about their unmet supportive care needs, there are a number of limitations to the current studies that we reviewed. Many of them are cross-sectional. There's very, very few. There's one longitudinal study from the American Cancer Society, but very few longitudinal studies. Most of the studies have small sample sizes, and they focus on particular subgroups of caregivers. And so, as I mentioned, I did my postdoc in Australia, and so when I joined Australia, the team in Australia, we embarked upon a longitudinal study of partners and caregivers of patients diagnosed with one of the 8 most common cancers in Australia. And at that time, it was only second to the one that was conducted or being conducted at that time by the American Cancer Society. Unfortunately, there's no comparable longitudinal study in Canada. And I think the literature has also moved beyond documenting caregivers' unmet needs, because there's across countries, there's been a lot of redundancy in terms of findings from these studies, and now much more moving into intervention. So the main aim of the study was to describe changes in anxiety, depression, quality of life, and unmet needs, and identify variables associated with this outcome. So that was the general goal of the longitudinal study. We provided a comprehensive survey at 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3.5 years, and 5 years. And people did receive quite a battery of questionnaires. So I presented actually 4 years ago, and when I presented at this same round, and when I presented on anxiety and depression across the first 3 waves. So today I'm presenting on the unmet supportive care needs across the 5 waves. So recently, believe it or not, it does take a long time to clean and analyze this kind of longitudinal data. So it's only been recent that we've been looking at all 5 waves. So for today, I thought that the 2 main objectives are to identify the type and prevalence of unmet supportive care needs among caregivers at all 5 data collection time points, as well as to look at what is the impact of experiencing particular needs on anxiety and depression at the same data collection time point. So some of you that might be familiar with collecting data or using data on unmet supportive care needs, another goal of this study was to also look at often is experiencing only one unmet supportive care need enough for caregivers. So what is the impact of really experiencing these unmet needs? So in terms of our demographics, very similar to what might be expected for this kind of study. So most of our sample were women, age 60 plus, living, being the spouse of the patient. And patients were diagnosed mostly with breast or prostate cancer or melanoma. So before I jump into the impact of unmet needs, I did want to provide a bit of information about the outcomes. So the outcomes in this case are anxiety and depression, and particularly give a bit of an update because, like I said before, when I presented in 2014, I presented only on the first 3 waves on anxiety and depression. So I thought it would be nice if some of you were there to present updated data, and also as I present on the unmet needs, having in mind the data on the outcomes. So most of you will be familiar with the HADS, that's the scale that we used. And because of previous psychometric studies with the HADS and with caregivers, we are particularly using 8+ as the significant cutoff. So when I present prevalence, it represents the cutoff of 8+. Okay, so in terms of anxiety over time, what we notice is that at baseline, about 1/3 of participants, 1/3 of caregivers reported a HAD score of 8 or more. So caregivers' prevalence is represented by the blue column. And across time, we noticed a decrease, a significant decrease, which we might expect. I guess the contribution of this longitudinal study is that this decrease is generally sustained, although it peters off towards the end of the trajectory. However, what is a contribution of this study is a comparison with the survivors, which is represent the prevalence of anxiety among the survivors, which is represented by the red column. And what we notice is that the caregivers across the first 3 data collection time points report higher anxiety than the survivors, but at the 3.5-year mark, that difference is no longer significant. For depression, it's a bit of a different story, and again, really emphasizing the value of this kind of data set. So at 6 months, and please note the scale on the left-hand side, it goes from 0 to 16, just to properly 16% and not to 100%. So at 6 months, again, the prevalence of depression among caregivers is represented by the blue bar, and we have 14% of caregivers that report depression or a score of 8 or more. That corresponds subscale of the HADS. And across the data collection time point, again, probably what we would expect, there's a significant decrease. What we did not expect, and again, having to go out for 5 years, to see a significant increase at 5 years, comparable almost to rates around the 1-year mark. And again, if we compare with the survivors, at this point we could conclude that caregivers reported similar levels of depression than the survivors. So last time I presented also what we refer to as differential patterns of anxiety and depression. So again, I thought I would just provide a bit of an update on those findings. I presented for the first 3 time points. Now we have them for the entire 5 years. So what we did here is that although we recognize that as a group, anxiety, in particular and to a certain extent depression, was resolved for our caregivers, it's possible that for some subgroups of caregivers, the anxiety or depression is chronic, or potentially some caregivers, anxiety and depression might worsen over time. So what we did what we were interested in is really teasing out subgroups of caregivers that might represent different trajectories of anxiety and depression over time. So here's the graph. What we found is 4 groups, And last time when I presented on the 3 data collection time points, there were also 4 groups. So what is worrisome is that there's not a lot of change between the 3-year data collection time point, the 3rd data collection time point, which is the 2-year mark, and the 5-year mark. So I'll present these findings with a bit more detail. So on the bottom, you have our data collection time points, our 5 data collection time points. For 2 subgroups, we are not too worried about their level of their score on the HADS. As you can see, it's well below the borderline cutoff score. However, there is a 3rd group that is hovering around what we call chronic borderline anxiety. And we expected a bit more of a steeper decline. And so as you can see, there is a steady decline, but the decline is not as steep as we would anticipate it. And even more worrisome, a score of 11 or more on the HADS is labeled a clinical cutoff point. And here we have a group of caregivers representing 11% experience chronic clinical anxiety, and a 1/3 that were hovering around the chronic borderline anxiety point. And for the results were a bit more variable after our 3rd data collection time point. So again, 5 total data collection time points, 2 subgroups of caregivers that we're not worried about. The good news is that it does represent more than 60% of the caregivers. However, there is a 3rd group of caregivers at risk of chronic borderline depression, and similarly a subgroup at risk for clinical levels on the HADS that are chronic clinical depression. So that was an update on the outcomes from my previous presentation, and just to give everybody an idea of what's going on in terms of anxiety and depression for caregivers. This is one of the only studies that really goes 5 years out. So again, some of you working with survivors and their families, just keeping in mind that level of, for some, at 5 years, especially potentially their level of depression. So now going into more the crux of the supportive care needs of partners and caregivers. So we use what we call the supportive care needs survey, partners and caregivers. Many of you might be familiar with the patient version of this scale. It was developed by Afa Gergis in Australia. Afa Gergis was my postdoc supervisor, and then we did an adaptation for partners and caregivers. So in terms of the prevalence of unmet needs across time, which is our first objective for today was type and prevalence. So 60% or almost 60% of caregivers experience some level of unmet need or reported at least one unmet supportive care need on that survey. And again, with time, there was a significant decrease, which again is what we expect. But again, we see that significant increase at 5 years. So you might recall we saw this with depression. We're seeing a similar pattern with the unmet supportive care needs. And in terms of the average number of unmet supportive care needs that were reported, baseline highest, with a significant decrease over time, with the exception of that 5-year mark. Now, what about what type of unmet needs did caregivers say that what type of support did they say that they needed more of? So again, on this graph, just be mindful of the scale in terms of percent of caregivers. It goes from 0 to 35%. And so we see that at 30% of caregivers really wanted more help with managing concerns about cancer coming back, reducing stress in the person with cancer, better understanding the experience of the person with cancer, balancing your needs with those of the patient, and managing fears about deterioration. Those are among the most prevalent ones. Now, if we start mapping wave after wave, which is what we were interested in, we start noticing that there's some overlap in terms of those unmet needs that are most prevalent. So you have the same that I just mentioned in terms of managing concerns about the cancer coming back, reducing stress in the person with cancer, better understanding the experience of the person with cancer, balancing your needs with those of the patient, adjusting to the person's change in body, dealing with the impact that cancer has had on your relationship, working through feelings about death, and addressing problems with sex life. So there was really 8 unmet needs that started to overlap between waves 1 and 2. And then when we mapped all of the waves, we noticed that there's these same unmet needs are among the top 10. So in terms of prevalence, we for this presentation, the cutoff is in the top 10. Wave after wave after wave after wave. And so these are what we call core dominant unmet needs. These eight unmet needs. And so these are reducing stress in the person, managing cancer, concerns about the cancer coming back, managing the impact cancer has had on your relationship, better understanding the experience of the person with cancer, balancing your needs and those of the patient, adjusting to changes in the person's body, addressing problems with sex life, and working through feelings about death. Now, I've coded these in orange, and just throughout the presentation, for Objective 2, in terms of knowing or better understanding what is the impact of these different unmet needs on the outcomes of anxiety and depression, just to keep track of these, the core dominant unmet needs will always be in orange. And now the second one, we've mapped unmet needs across the 5 waves. So we identified 8 core dominant unmet needs, so that's interesting. However, we also noticed that there were 3 unmet needs that were in the top 10 from waves 2 to 5. So they weren't in wave 1, but from waves 2 to 5, they were present. And so we've labeled these frequent unmet needs. And throughout the presentation, these will be in this burgundy color. So the 8 core dominant unmet needs for the remainder of the presentation are in orange, these ones in burgundy, and these were looking after your own health, getting emotional support for self, and making decisions in the context of uncertainty. So from 12 months to 5 years, these were in the top 10. So what are the implications of the findings for Objective 1? Well, now that we know that we have core and frequent unmet needs, what we might then say is that, well, these potentially, this cluster of 11 unmet needs in terms of developing caregiver interventions, these might be the ones that we want to target. And ultimately, our hypothesis would potentially be that targeting these unmet needs through an intervention would have a significant impact in terms of reducing anxiety and depression. So that's what we hope. However, the current literature on caregiver interventions have yielded mixed effects, and unmet supportive care needs intervention in general have also resulted in mixed effects, where they don't necessarily have the aspired impact on outcomes such as anxiety and depression. And what our team has hypothesized on that is that to a certain extent we're making the leap that the most prevalent ones are also the ones that are most problematic, which might or might not be the case. And typically also we've put an arbitrary, to a certain extent, or artificial cutoff point of, the top 5 or the top 10, and those are the ones that we will address. So instead, our team was interested in pushing the field a bit further and looking at what are those unmet needs most associated with anxiety and depression, to then be able to say, well, actually, yes, it is the ones that are most prevalent, or no, it's actually not the ones that are most prevalent, even if there are 15% of people that might be experiencing a certain unmet need, that's the one that's more, if you are experiencing that unmet need, that is the one that is most associated with anxiety or depression. So the problem often with unmet needs, I think the reason why typically in the unmet needs literature we've relied on unmet need count or means to look at the relationship between unmet needs and anxiety and depression. And I should say that generally that relationship has been found to be positive. So number of unmet needs or the mean level of unmet needs has been positively associated with anxiety and depression. So we've relied on composite scores, and that relationship has been in a number of studies documented. So, and a reason I think we've relied on composite scores is because, like the support care needs survey, for example, there are 45 items. If we rely on our typical linear or logistic regression, it's just too many. Also, many of the unmet needs are highly correlated. So it's just not the kind of data set that is appropriate for regular regressions. So what our team did is that we turned towards other forms of regression. So we used partial least square regression. So we're lucky at St. Mary's Research Center to be working with a team of statisticians that work in health service research broadly, and presented this issue that we had in terms of analyzing unmet needs and trying to figure out which one. And in other fields, partial least square regression is actually very common to try to reduce a long list of variables to a more manageable list of variables that you would then consider in a regression, in a linear regression analysis. So I'll present are the results from partial least square regression at 6 months. Okay, so to interpret this graph, on the left-hand side, we have the same thing that we've had before in terms of the percent of caregivers needing more help with an item. And and the red line are the results of the partial least square regression. Again, the goal being, can we reduce the list of unmet needs to a subset of those that, based on this first analysis, seem to be most associated with depression and anxiety. And for the results of the PLS, we're interested whenever the red line goes above 1, which I indicated with the horizontal black line. So you'll remember that typically we're interested in the top 10. So when we look at when the red line is above 1, we notice that most of those core dominant unmet needs, which are indicated by an orange circle on this graph, go above the 1 in terms of PLS results. You will notice, though, that addressing problems with sex life, although prevalent in terms of this analysis, did not seem to be significantly associated with anxiety and depression. What I do want to emphasize is that the results for the PLS are almost higher for some unmet needs that, if we do rely on the top 10, would not have been considered, including 3 of the frequent unmet needs that we were interested in. So the ones that were prevalent from waves 2 to 5, but not at 6 months. This included, for example, looking after your own health. So again, when we do this for the second wave, so at year 1, again, we're interested each time the red line is above the 1 cutoff for the PLS results. If we look at the top 10, again, most of our orange unmet needs, so most of those core dominant unmet needs are above the line. We do have a few that don't quite make the cutoff score, so addressing problems with sex life, again, if you recall in wave 1, just didn't make the cutoff in terms of significance with anxiety and depression. And so our frequent unmet needs, those in burgundy, again, especially making decisions in the context of uncertainty, were found to be most associated with anxiety and depression. So the result of the PLS, I should have said, provided value of association with both outcomes, depression and anxiety. Interestingly, one unmet need that we would not usually consider potentially, if relying on the top 10, had the highest or the most significant association with depression and anxiety, and that was impact of cancer onto your working life. So again, not necessarily prevalent, but for those caregivers in that situation, it was one of the unmet needs most associated with depression and anxiety. So again, if we do this wave after wave after wave, we notice that between 15 and 20 unmet needs across time are associated with depression and anxiety. PLS is meant really to reduce the number of variables. So now we wanted to even reduce even further by considering these variables in a regression analysis. And so that's what we did for each time point. And these are the results. What I'll do now is that I'll point out key patterns that I think are new and significant if either working with caregivers or planning on a caregiver intervention. So the first thing that we notice is that we were able to even further reduce the number of unmet needs to only 1 to 4 unmet needs being significant. So addressing the issue, if you are of an unmet needs survey, I think what this analysis also might point out is that even if there is one unmet need, if it is, in this case, at 3.5 years, for example, managing the concerns about cancer coming back, that is the most significant unmet need for that time for those caregivers. So even if they didn't take any of the other one, that one is having a significant impact. The other thing I want to point out is if you remember those orange unmet needs, so our core dominant unmet needs, there's only 3 out of the 8 that made it in our significant association. However, all of our, at some point in time, made it in our, all of the frequent unmet needs, so those burgundy unmet needs, made it in the level of significance at some point in time. And so it was particularly significant for looking after your own health at 2 years, getting emotional support later on in the survivorship trajectory, and making decisions in the context of it was particularly significant early on. And then unmet needs that typically would not even make it on our radar because of our traditional approach of relying on prevalence were also significant across time. So for those caregivers experiencing these unmet needs, these were significant. I do also want to emphasize that all the unmet needs led to a difference greater than the minimal clinically significant difference on the HAS of 1.5. So it ranged from 1.57 to 3.50. So again, experiencing any of these unmet needs led to a difference between those that had the unmet needs versus those that did not, and the difference of anxiety and depression that we would consider not only statistically significant, but clinically significant as well. The picture for depression is slightly different. Although at each time point also, there weren't that many unmet needs that were significant, again, between 1 and 3. So again, at 6 months, if you recall, item 42 is in burgundy because it was not a prevalent unmet need. It was prevalent as of 1 year onward. But at 6 months, despite not being prevalent, it is the one and unique unmet need that was most significantly associated. None of the core, we don't see any orange needs here, so none of the core unmet needs were significant for depression, which again, I think might explain to a certain extent why our caregiver interventions sometimes do not have an impact on depression. And again, many more less prevalent unmet needs that were significant at different ways. And those unmet needs items with an asterisk are those that were also significant for anxiety. And again, All unmet needs led to a difference greater than the minimal clinically significant difference on the HAD. So implications for caregiver interventions. I think that after these analyses, how I would approach developing caregiver interventions is that we might have some main modules that might focus on skills training, focus on some of the core dominant unmet needs, as well as those that are frequent, and then have optional modules that would be offered and tailored based on the most significant unmet needs, so that if the caregiver is experiencing this particular unmet need, and they would be provided with these modules, or even, especially with technology today, if you screen caregivers for their unmet needs and they experience some of the significant ones, those are potentially the modules that you would want to prioritize to have the biggest impact, hopefully, on anxiety and depression, which in caregiver research, anxiety, depression, quality of life are the typical distal outcomes that we try to target. So this is almost my last slide. So in terms of our team, we've definitely picked up on these findings, and now we are developing TEMPO, which stands for a Tailored Web-Based Self-Management and Physical Activity Program, actually collaborating with, at your institution, Andrew Matthews, as well as Daniel Santamina. It is a pan-Canadian study funded by Prostate Cancer Canada. So picking up on some of the unmet needs of looking after your own health. For me, I've been developing caregiver interventions for a while now. That's not an unmet need that I've given much attention to, but not only did it come up in our findings, but in previous intervention studies, caregivers wanting more information on diet and nutrition and physical activity came up. So picking up on that recommendation here, and also in terms of tailoring. So we don't, TEMPO is not a content-based module intervention, so we don't say module 1, you learn how to communicate with your healthcare team. Number 2, you deal with symptoms. Module 3, relationship advice. Number 4, communication. We really do a needs assessment, and then based on their most prevalent, not prevalent, but based on their needs, and given what we know about the impact of those needs, then we tailor the content accordingly. So hopefully this is a prototype. We've just finished the development. We're in feasibility. So maybe in another 2 years, we can come and present some of the findings of this intervention study. So thank you very much.